Mr. Evans, what I'm planning on doing is to ask the question that the juror had asked and then allow either side to have additional opportunities to question the witness. All right. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, before we took our mid-morning break, one of you had submitted a question that I've gone over on the record with counsel, and as a result, I'm going to ask that question. The question that was submitted, Doctor, is this: are the deviations additive or cumulative in such that abnormalities plus drug use plus medications plus conditions they are in would result in a significant deviation?
Well, it's a really good question.
Wasn't my question, but I appreciate it.
But it's still a good question. Unfortunately, the brain is always a lot more complicated than any of us like it to think. But, on one hand, I guess I would answer it in sort of two ways. One is that, on one hand, a whole variety of factors can certainly add up to bring somebody to where they are. So whether that's head injuries, trauma, other types of emotional traumas, drugs, medications, all of these things ultimately kind of, have an impact on a person. But if the question is ultimately about the specific findings of the PET scan, as I was thinking a little bit about the question, part of it is that that a lot of those factors kind of balance each other out a little bit too. So when you have certain drugs, they might increase the brain. When you have certain medications, they might decrease the brain. An anti-seizure medication, when you have a seizure, the brain gets very high in terms of its activity, but then the medication will help to settle it down. So I think in terms of the findings that we're looking at, again, I think the magnitude of the finding of all these different areas, that to me kind of goes beyond what I might expect for some type of additive effect to occur from all these different pieces. But in terms of what brings a person to where they are, there probably is some degree of an additive effect, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. Could I see counsel, please? We're gonna. Mr. Evans, General Crouch. I think it's easier for.
And this is on the record. For the record, we have examined and discussed this question that was submitted by one of the jurors and disagreed that I will not ask that question, but I will instruct the jury that the decision in this case must be based on the evidence and the facts and the law that's submitted to the jury.
All right, Mr. Evans, did you have any additional questions for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, there was a question in addition to the one I just asked that was submitted by one of you, and I am not going to ask that question, and I would instruct you that this decision that you have to make must be based upon the law that I give to you and the facts as found by you from the trial and from this sentencing hearing only. And that's the instruction I would give you. All right, thank you.
Dr. Newberg, is Stephen Wiggins' brain damaged?
Yes, it's an abnormal brain.
And in making that decision, you took into account not just your scan, but you reviewed social history, is that correct?
Correct, in terms of connecting everything together, yes.
And Did Stephen's abnormal brain correlate to the symptoms that you noted in the social history?
Yes, I believe it did.
And that symptomatology was consistent with the damage you noted in his brain in both the PET and the MRI?
Correct.
And you were asked about where the PET was performed. Do you recall that it was performed at Vanderbilt?
Yes.
Now, you've discussed the terms, and in your report, mild and moderate. Are those terms of art?
Yes.
Could you describe what does mild mean?
For the way I typically use it in the context of these reports, so that, as I mentioned, if your if you are above the 1.65, which is what is given as this in the software as considered to be abnormal, if you're above that, up until about 2 standard deviations, I usually refer to that as mild. If you're above 2 to about 3, I usually refer to that as moderate, and then above 3, that to me would be more severe.
And someone, when you're using this term mild and or moderate, or mild to moderate,
Right.
could they still have, or would they still necessarily have significant impairments based on that abnormal braining?
Yeah, absolutely. Very small changes in the brain can have very substantial and devastating effects for a person.
You were asked several questions about executive function, and I want to kind of talk about that for a minute. I think you said one of the issues with Stephen's brain specifically is, and the damage to the frontal lobe is impulsivity. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you talked about frontal lobe damage and high stress situations. And I believe your testimony was it can prevent them from resolving high stress situations properly.
Correct.
So does that mean if someone is presented with a high stress situation that they lose the ability to react at all if they have these brain impairments?
No, they don't lose their ability completely at all. It's just that they may not be able to handle it as effectively as possible.
And you also said, if I recall, didn't you say it could include them making poor decisions in how they react?
Correct.
So, my understanding, you someone with this frontal lobe damage that affects their executive function, it could that cause them to react in an extreme way that was a poor decision,
Yes, I would think so. Yep.
or without thinking, as you
Correct.
said. So, is the frontal lobe kind of like the brakes?
It certainly can be. Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so you talked about impulsivity, the idea of not thinking. I think you said before you do something,
Right.
and I think you said not thinking before you speak. But would that also apply in this frontal lobe damage that Stephen has, of that inability to think before taking action?
Absolutely. The frontal lobes are involved in not only the generation of speech, but generating all of our behaviors as well.
Yeah. And would that necessarily mean, even though someone acted impulsively, that they couldn't react in certain impulsive ways?
So they certainly could react in impulsive ways, certainly people can also, in those circumstances, make some parts of the decisions might be good, and then other parts are not.
Right. And still be able to complete a task.
Yes.
But you talked about driving without GPS and doing all these things. But what you're talking about with this frontal lobe damage, that person arguably can still drive the car in your analogy, right?
Correct.
And if something jumped out in front of the car, they might even though they had this frontal lobe damage, still know to swerve.
Correct.
Correct?
Correct. Right. It doesn't eliminate function. It just it makes the function not as good or not as stable, so that you might make the wrong decisions at times.
And you you were asked several questions about how different stimulus would affect the brain, or what about seizures?
Well, seizures can have a big effect on the brain, and certainly they can alter behavior. And given the fact that there is this structural abnormality, that's certainly a potential site where a seizure could begin and could have substantial effects on both emotions as well as behaviors.
And as part of your review of documents informing your opinion in this case, did you review the report of Dr. Melissa Karen?
Yes.
Right, and what, if any, significance did you extrapolate from her report as to how Stephen Wiggins' brain functions?
I think, just in the sense that the various abnormalities that were discussed seem to be consistent with what we're seeing in the scan.
Those are my questions, Judge. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Mr. Wyatt?
Doctor, to make sure I understood correctly the response you had to Mr. Evans a second ago,
Yes.
you're saying that the person would be able to drive the car with these impairments. They'd be able to drive a car, correct?
It certainly could, yes.
And as Mr. Evans pointed out, if something came in front of them, they'd be able to brake and avoid that, correct?
Potentially, yes.
And so they'd also potentially be able to drive a vehicle with a body in the back to a location to hide it and burn it, correct?
I suppose.
Thank you.
Anything further for this witness?
Very brief. Doctor, if the person did that, it would still indicate they had impairments with their executive functioning, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Wyatt? Thank you, Doctor. You may step down and we'll release you from further testimony. You are free to. Mr. Evans, you had indicated that the next witness is the one that you indicated was going to have testimony that was not to be published. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, the next witness is expected to testify about some matters that traditionally are not published outside of the courtroom. Therefore, I'm going to instruct the news media that this will be another instance where the live stream will need to be terminated and we will need to resume as soon as this witness is concluded. So we will stop our streaming and allow this to resume after the witness has testified. Are you going to stop it?